Hi, thank you. Yes, I'm Yin Q, and I have had the pleasure of being the artist disruptor on campus this past semester. I'm here with, on behalf of Red Canary Song, which is a collective of Asian migrant massage workers and sex workers. We are based in Flushing, Queens, and we have been working with Professor Elena Shi for the past 5 years or more. And I'm just so honored to be able to introduce this fantastic group of scholars and learn from them more. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Elena Shi. She is the Manning Assistant Professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies and directs a human traffic research cluster through Brown's Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. She recently published her first book, Manufacturing Freedom. Yes. Sex work, anti-trafficking rehab, and the racial wages of rescue, published by University of California Press, a global ethnography of the transnational social movement to combat human trafficking in China, Thailand, and the United States. Locally, she serves on the board of the Alliance to Mobilize Our Resistance, a coalition of 5 Rhode Island organizations working to combat state violence, and is a core collective member of Red Canary Song. And I would also love to introduce Kamala Kempadu, has just this year retired as professor in the Department of Social Science at York University, with former graduate appointments in gender, feminist, and women's studies, political science, social and political thought, and developmental studies. She is the author of dozens of articles and books, including 1, Sexing the Caribbean, Gender, Race, and Sexual Labor, and 2, Sun, Sex, and Gold, Tourism and Sex Work in the Caribbean, and has co-edited several vital edited volumes, including Global Sex Workers, Rights, Resistance, and Redefinition, and is also co-editor of Trafficking and Prostitution Reconsidered, New Perspectives on Migration, Sex Work, and Human Rights. In 2018, she was awarded the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality's Distinguished Scientific Achievement Award for her contributions to the field of sexology. She was also awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Caribbean Studies Association in the same year. Next year, Kamala will join the Brown community as a visiting professor at the Center for Latin America and Caribbean Studies at Brown.
It's wonderful to share the stage with some of my contributors and, of course, with Elena. This is our first book launch here in the United States. We had one in Canada, in Toronto, earlier, but I'm delighted that we can bring our book here. This book has a long and weighty title, and it took a while to come to fruition, due in large part to the pandemic, of course. But I'm really pleased that it made it into the world and stands on its own. I really want to thank the Center for Study of Race and Ethnicity in America for organizing this event, and of course to Elena. And I'm especially thrilled to be able to share this launch with, or this event with Samukere, Jose Miguel, and Flavia Mello, who will come on screen, I think, join us by Zoom, who will be coming in from Brazil. They will all be speaking, I think, about their own chapters, so I'm not going to tell you about them. The book is very global in scope, and that was very intentional. This book was really important to me. Since the late 1980s, I've been following and writing about anti-trafficking, starting with activism during grad student years, with a group of Dutch and Asian feminists in the Netherlands, when a concern about the traffic of women emerged. And it was being raised then around the number of Thai and Filipino women working in the Dutch sex industry. And it was a group of feminists who at the time were working between the Netherlands and Asia. And they actually gave birth to the group that's now called the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, which Elena and I are also on the editorial board of their journal, the Anti-Trafficking Review. And GATW is based in Bangkok and still a very vibrant NGO that works on the issue of the trafficking of women. But this activity led to my doctoral research on sex work in the Caribbean. You heard a couple of the titles of the books that came out from that. And simultaneously to closely following the emergence of the 2000 UN Protocol on Trafficking. And since then, I've continued to critically engage with debates on the issue from my academic positions in the US, the Caribbean, and Canada, in association with sex worker rights groups and transnational feminists. I was from the outset very skeptical about the ways in which the debate on trafficking of women, centered on brown and black women from the global south, who were primarily cast in the debate as helpless, passive victims. And it was this racialized dimension of anti-trafficking that not only stayed with me, but attracted more and more of my attention as time went on. And as the debate about trafficking got deeper and involved more people, became tangled with ideas about modern slavery, and created a whole industry that predominantly revolved around white, global, North-inspired saviorism, I became, much more focused on anti-trafficking as opposed to sex work and about the racism and racialization of anti-trafficking. And while the group of critical-minded scholars and activists grew, there was a remarkably small number of people of color doing this work, and even fewer whose focus spanned both the global south and north. So I was really and truly excited to learn about Elena Shee's research and perspective, and found we shared so much in common around our critique of anti-trafficking, including grounding our work in migrant sex workers' organizations. And as you've heard, she works very closely with Red Canary Song and other groups, as I have done in my work over the years. Racism, coloniality, and global North dominance in the anti-trafficking industry was so apparent to us both that we had to do something together. And this book was the result. And it's been such a pleasure to work with her and to be inspired by her energy, enthusiasm, and warmth. And for those of you who know Elena, know how bubbly and warm and exciting a scholar she is. This book, we know, is just a small drop in the ocean, as there's much more work that has been done and is happening in the academy and on the ground on racism and coloniality of anti-trafficking. Several of the contributors have, for example, recently published their own single-authored books that elaborate and deepen the ideas presented in our book, including Elena's brilliant study that's just come out and was mentioned in Manufacturing Freedom, Lindsay Buten's Trafficking in Anti-Blackness, and Greg Mitchell's Panics Without Borders. And there are other books forthcoming, and I expect we'll hear a bit about it as well. Other contributors have continued to resist the racisms that pervade everyday policing and state control of migrant sex workers' lives, such as the work by Elaine Lam in Toronto and Nada de Cat in Australia, through their activism. All contributors see the racialized inequalities that are playing out in the name of anti-trafficking. But it's the first time that we came together to collectively voice our critique, and that's the book. So we hope this book gives food for thought and continues to support the work of those like Elaine and myself who are facing the giant anti-trafficking industry that so easily grabs people's attentions, heartstrings, and purses. After all these years, I remain convinced that anti-trafficking does greater harm than good. And so I hope to continue to expose it in the name of racial justice, decoloniality, and freedom. Thank you.
I would like to also introduce Samuel Ochere, Senior Lecturer in Sociology, School of Sociology, Politics, and International Studies at the University of Bristol. Sam Ochere specializes in critical reflections on the interplay between human rights, power, inequality, ethnicity, and class under conditions of globalization. Sam's work brings into sharp focus the lingering deleterious effects of the transatlantic slave trade and colonization on formerly colonized communities, as well as the oppressive impacts of anti-trafficking and modern slavery rhetoric on migratory discourses.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and a big thanks as well, particularly to Elena and Kamala, whose work have really inspired me. And I think when I was asked to contribute to this edited volume, I was really delighted because, as Kamala just said, it was for the first time bringing together themes which span many of our works, but which hadn't been given the kind of emphasis or focus that it deserved. And so I was really thrilled to be able to contribute to this edited volume. And my contribution stems from a scene which greeted me when I was in Ghana, where I'm originally from. I visited a local police station with a friend, and when we came across an image similar to what you've got on the screen there, this is taken from one of the country's newspapers. A group of women, about 15 of them, had been lined up in the hot baking sun. And I asked the police officer why, what was happening, and he said they are victims of trafficking. And I said, but if you say they are victims, why are they, as it were, being punished? Because it was blazing hot that afternoon. And he had no answer for me. They were all Nigerian women as well. And that really stayed with me. So I was looking into this. I was looking at the nation's newspapers, and it became apparent that over the last 3 years, this was in 2018, there had been a stream, as people say it, of Nigerian women coming into Ghana who were mostly getting involved in sex work. And so I became very interested in finding out what was leading to this new migration trend. Now, Ghana and Nigeria have always had these connections, but I think this real kind of emergent trend was new. And what became clear from my research with 16 of these women was a decision by the European Union in 2015 to use border externalization to, as it put it in the policy document, then best effect, basically to use it as a means of migration deterrence. Just for reference, border externalization refers to measures where very often a more powerful country compels a less powerful, politically speaking, country to adopt measures ranging from extra security checks on people migrating from the less powerful country's territory into its own. And in this case, the European Union or EU countries have, over the last several decades, implemented several of these measures, notable among which was the EU agreement with Libya, which meant that migrants were being stopped in that country from crossing the Mediterranean into Europe, many getting stuck there and facing, running the gauntlet of sometimes armed groups and others. And this was reported by the CNN as a new African slave trade in quite sensationalist terms, leaving out the real issue, which was the fact that migrants who were seeking better lives, refugees and asylum seekers who were seeking shelter, were being prevented from doing so because of some of these measures and getting stuck in Europe, where they were at the mercy of both Libyan officials acting on behalf of EU, the European Union, as well as just armed groups and others. Now, in the Nigerian context, what had happened was that, first of all, as you can see on the screen, an enormous amount of money was being spent on anti-trafficking campaigns and modalities, as I discussed in my chapter contribution to the book. In fact, over the last, I think since 2000, analysis shows that the EU has spent over 1.5 billion euros on measures that are mainly related to border deterrence. As you can see, over 389 million euros has been spent on border controls. And even when it relates to job creation, this is mainly jobs relating to border control. So for instance, you see job creation there, 142 million euros devoted to that since 2000. That is mainly going to the Nigerian anti-trafficking unit called NAPTIP. Some of the figures there are included in the 142. And you can see at the very bottom of your screen, 0.3. This is 300,000 euros compared to 389 million euros, 300,000 euros for providing safe and legal migration routes for Nigerians who seek to move into Europe. And you can see in the campaigns, they are mostly about messages which, present migration as a threat to Nigerians. So they tell Nigerian women in particular that they are at risk of being exploited and harmed, and therefore to stay home. And I compare this with a campaign which was also launched in the United Kingdom by the then DFID, Department for International Development, where they spent over $50 million on what is called the stamping out slavery. So again, as Kamala said, you see how the narrative of modern slavery is marshaled to create fear and panic about migration, in particular in Nigeria and other countries. Because I live in the UK, and no British student or British young female who wants to migrate would be told in no uncertain terms to stay home at the risk of becoming a victim of trafficking or a victim of modern slavery. And yet in Nigeria, you had campaigns like that one there, funded to the tune of over $50 million, scaring Nigerian young women to stay home at the risk of becoming modern slaves in Europe and elsewhere. And as if that was not enough, part of the funding has also been used to station what are called immigration liaison officers in Nigeria. These are European Union migration officials who are sent to Nigeria. And in fact, Nigeria is about, I think, Nigeria and Pakistan and India. These are the only 3 countries globally who have got an ILO from almost every EU country stationed in their international airports. So in the Nigerian context, you've got EU ILOs stationed at the 2 international airports, and they randomly pull out of the queue Nigerian young women. Again, emphasis on women. It's a very gendered dimension to it here. Who they deem to be at risk of trafficking. And what happens, speaking to my interviewees, you get a list of questions rattled at you. Who are you going to see? How did you get your visa? Where are you traveling from? Was anybody involved in getting your visa? How long have you known this person? Questions which I think if you haven't prepared for them, even if you have, you might stumble up, on a couple of them. And if you do, then you are denied the chance of traveling. And so a lot of Nigerian women, including the 16 I spoke with, said that they had heard, or a couple of them had actually experienced it. And in one case, this young woman whose partner was in Europe, she tried to join him. She'd applied for a visa legitimately, I think on 3 occasions, and had been refused. All her savings were gone, and so she had used the service of a travel facilitator, and because of that, at the 4th time, she was again arrested. Her family had to pay bribe to get her out of immigration detention. So what had happened in this context was that a lot of Nigerian women, so that quote there on the screen is what I was referring to earlier. This young woman called Mary, who said she was in the queue. Two police officers came out and took her to some room somewhere. They got her passport and asked her where she got her visa from. She told them everything, which was truthful, but they said she was lying and that she was going to do, as they say in the language, ashao. Basically, we suspect you're going to participate in prostitution in Europe. And because a third party was involved in getting your visa, that makes you a potential victim of trafficking. And we're therefore going to save you, as it were, from slavery. And the mode of saving was to place her in immigration detention, and at the end of which her family had to pay a bribe to get her out. And, you know, these narratives are becoming kind of regular among the young women that I have interviewed in Ghana and elsewhere. And so you've got the women, mainly women now moving, as you can see on the map, from Nigeria, crossing through to Benin, Togo, into Ghana, where they hope to be able to move because ILOs are not stationed there at the moment. Now, because they are having to make these journeys, it means the cost of their travel has also become more expensive. And because many of them are relying on travel facilitators, what they are having to do is get involved in precarious work, among which is prostitution, in West Africa itself, before the travel facilitator may agree to help them to move on to the next step. So they're having to pay for the West African leg of the journey, as it were. And so, as my participants kept telling me, they were very much aware of the anti-trafficking initiatives, which are seductively presented as benevolent or humanitarian, but which in their experience is far from that, because it's actually compounding their risks. They are having to pay more money to be able to migrate. And it's very clearly in their eyes driven by anti-Black discrimination. As the analysis I present in the chapter shows, this mode of immobilizing, as it were, mobility from West Africa continues a long line of systems and practices which have been used to prevent Black Africans from migrating and therefore being able to participate equally in the global political economy and have the same access to the rights and freedoms which a lot of people are able to enjoy without having to resort to the services of travel facilitators and others. So my central argument in the chapter is that anti-trafficking and anti-smuggling modalities, despite the kind of very emollient way in which they are presented as forms of care and compassion, at least in the context of EU border deterrence and border externalization measures, are very much driven by racism and a concern with keeping Africans in their place. There is a lot of talk about, it's almost as if the whole of Africa is emptying out into Europe. And yet when you look at the evidence, Africans are among the least traveled persons in the world. A lot of research shows most Africans wish to migrate across the continent itself, and most migration in Africa happens within the continent and not outside it. Nigeria itself also gets a very bad rap, as some of you may know. It's equated with, quite sensationalist claims of voodoo and juju and stuff used to trick or coerce young women into modern slavery. And yet when you look at the evidence, you're talking about a country of over 220 million people. And even if you had, say, 10,000 of them migrating a year, again, it's still way less in comparison to migration from other countries. And in the EU itself, no sub-Saharan African country makes the top 20 list of non-EU nationals within the European Union. So when emphasis is placed on mass migration from Africa, it simply represents a moral panic and a distortion of reality, which lends itself very well to the sorts of racist discriminatory practices which we see taking place in anti-trafficking and anti-migration measures. So that is my chapter. Thank you very much again to Elena and Kamala and to everybody for having me.
I would also like to introduce next speaking is Jose Miguel Nieto Oliva, Professor of Health, Life Cycles and Society at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Jose Miguel Nieto Oliva conducts anthropological research on sex markets, violence, mobilities, the borderland, and the state. He is currently developing a long-term research project on experimentations of struggle and care in critical contexts, in dialogue with Black poetics and feminisms, decolonial and indigenous knowledge. Jose will also be speaking with Flavia Malo, who works in the areas of gender, violence, public policy, debt, and borders in the Amazon region, mainly in the Alto Rio Solimos and Alto Rio Negro. She is currently a member of the faculty of the Department of Anthropology and coordinates the graduate program in social anthropology. She is a member of the Human Rights Commission of the Brazilian Association of Anthropology and is assistant professor at the Federal University of Amazonas, Brazil.
Okay, thank you very much, Kamala and Elena. I'm very honored to be here. I'm very nervous too. And thank you for the book. It's a wonderful book. Thank you so much. Okay, I will talk a little bit about a global idea of the chapter, of our chapter, that it's called The Cage and the Racialization of the Amazon, Reflections on Racism and Geopolitics in the Struggle Against Human Trafficking in Brazil. It is important to say that it is pre-pandemic and pre-Bolsonaro. So it is actually important. Here is Flavia. Okay. Our argument in this chapter is that looking from the Brazilian Amazon and its borderlands, the anti-human trafficking campaign actively participated in the performative updating of a legacy of colonial governance technology related to the racialized management of Amazonian territory. This technology of governance we refer to is old and multidimensional. It has been going through a process of irregular construction, revision, and reinvention from the times of the first European colonization of the Amazon. From then until now, in different forms and with different arrangements, its principal agents have been the strategic relations between the state, colonial, imperial, or republican, local, national, transnational, or multilateral, diverse armed and exploitational forces, different mercantile and commercial agents focused on the exploitation of natural resources, and very important in our case, Christian institutions, mainly Catholic Church. As a narrative strategy in the chapter, our analysis unfolds from an ethnographic research and a specific scenario that took place in 2014 in one of the cities that we researched in the Brazilian Colombia borderland, which lead us directly to the fetish image of the cage, like a live propaganda of the campaign, of the anti-trafficking campaign. A local Catholic poor, and let me talk about this 1 second, a local Catholic poor and racialized woman and her moral suspected young daughter in 2014 were literally put in a cage in the main city's street for the public launch and sensitization of the anti-trafficking campaign. In this chapter, we show some of the political arrangements locating trafficking in the Amazon. It is how the effective arriving of anti-trafficking in the Brazilian Amazon borderlands was forged over the second decade of the 21st century and was the result of the articulation of at least three forces. the growth and expansion of the national and transnational lobby of the anti-trafficking campaign, the gradual intensification of defense and security discourses over Brazilian borderlands in the leftist government, and the particular civilizer disposition of diverse agents of governmentality in thinking and imagining the geographical territory made up of borders and the Amazon. These forces connected in the impressive capillarity and multi-level interest of the transnational Catholic Church. In this sense, we deal with colonial racism, humanitarianism, and capillarity on the upgrading of missionary power in the Amazon. This because between late 2013 and 2014, the anti-trafficking struggle gained discursive, institutional, and practical space in small and medium-sized Amazonian cities in states such as Pará and Amazonas in Brazil. The key to this insertion was the link between women's organizations, actors and institutions in the justice and social assistance sectors in the state, and in particular, the Brazilian Catholic Church via the 2014 fraternity campaign called Brotherhood and Human Trafficking. This is the point in time when the public performance of the cage took place. In 2014, performance made way for the creation of the anti-trafficking and anti-sexual exploitation transborder network by a Brazilian Catholic missionary in Tabatinga, Brazil. This local transborder network worked close and made part of the Scream for Life network, Un Grito pela Vida, Rede Un Grito pela Vida, about which Flavia will talk better in some seconds. But before this, let me close this argument remembering that an important regional actor of the campaign, a Catholic, leftist, and feminist scholar, became an important reference on this subject for High Catholic Church officialdom and represented the country, Brazil, in events organized by the Vatican, including the very important Synod of Bishops in 2019, focused on the Amazon. So today, this perspective of traffic and the region is part of the Vatican's official statements about the Amazon. I cannot read here for a question of time, but we can talk about this after in questions. Finally, in this chapter, we show some effects of a new kind of humanitarian and neo-colonial commodity racism, as called by historian Annie McClintock. Effects of the colonial underpinnings and of the strategic misuse of history and of critique, or of the inability to take seriously reflections upon history and racism in contemporary Amazon. So, Flavia, please.
Thanks, Jose. First, I would like to give thanks once more to Kamala and Elena to invite me to be part of the book with the Val University, and also to San, who joined us for this event, and especially for the opportunity of participating in this launching of the book, this time in Brown. My effort in this brief intervention is to make 3 points that have to do with a methodological, theoretical point of view of these persistent interpretations that have been happening in the Amazon territory. This is an effort that Jose Miguel and I have been doing since many years ago, since we began to work and to investigate together about the Amazon. All these frameworks have an effect over the Amazon, an Amazon that is always generalized and racialized, including, and this is what we were talking about in the article of the book, including state practice through social politics, like the politics of fighting against the traffic of people in the Brazilian Amazon. So the first idea I want to talk about and expose is that the Amazon is the constant thought that Amazon populations are vulnerable. This assumption of vulnerability surpasses policies and politics in Brazil, even before the Bolsonaro government. And I also believe that in the next years, this notion of vulnerability has a lot of weight in the way that images of the Amazon are constructed and of the Amazonian populations with a strong call to the emotion. The stone as a way of governance that moves empathy and moves people from outside of the Amazon territory, a Christian and humanitarian focus with this originary populations, indigenous, Black, who inhabit the Amazonian territory. And this vulnerable population, in this assumption, which is very present in the way that we think and we act about the Amazon, in this type of population, we also have women, girls, that are seen as vulnerable because of their nature, because of their exuberant nature. So those women, those girls are metaphors of the Amazon vulnerable territory because of poverty, associated paradoxically to the abundance of the natural resources of the Amazon, and at the same time, the systematic reiteration of an absent state that requires in all time being protected and having this territory protected against a foreign enemy. I think this is the first framework that we have to, start fixing, so we can start thinking about what we are showing about human trafficking in Brazil, and especially in the Amazon territory. The second point that is also in our article has to do with the colonization legacies, not thinking in the past, but as legacies that are recognized continuously, that are here rooted in the particular way of governing the sexuality of the Amazon populations, and that have in the militarization in masculine bodies of the police force, and in the missionaries, actually the whiteness of the foreigners, as two very important institutions in different eras of history, of the history of the Amazon region. The militarization and the missionaryization have orientated and continue orientating ways of acting of the state of the government of the Amazon. The governments that have been built by these institutions that are in the Amazon territory. If you think about the policies that they use against trafficking and human trafficking, then it's very important to realize that there's a very strong investment in occupying, very strong investment since a long time ago, in occupying the bodies and the wombs of the Amazon women. That implies sexual reproduction, the raping, and the raping by the military forces, but not only by the. This effort has never been stronger because the militaries want to occupy, literally, like I said, the wombs of the Amazon women. But this is something that you can't just say as if it's an accident or an effect, an unwanted effect. It's due to a policy, an organized policy, like an action plan of all the police forces who act in the constitution of families as if it was a recognized civil constitution recognized by the state, but also religiously recognized by the churches, especially in the Catholic example that we're talking about much more in this chapter in the region. So in this way, the Amazon territory is always seen as a vulnerable territory, a territory that is empty, and a territory that is wild, and especially amongst women. And this is very important because all the construction, the police, military force, and the church are always acting in that process of occupying, and also in a process of monitoring sexuality. In the context of trafficking of humans, we can talk about Grito por la Vida, the network of Grito por la Vida, and the support of the police force, especially the ones who are dedicated to working in controlling immigration. The third point that I want to close my contribution on this theme has to do with even how scientific people are also part of this assumption. And this has to do with all the time that Jose and I have been trying to manage, in the sense that I've been talking before, about how we take images from how activism, how there's a certain feminist activism, especially in Brazil, that are led by these frameworks that try to always conceive the Amazon territory as the same vulnerable territory, or allowing ways of government, like religious governments or military governments, to act over the bodies and the sexuality of the women in the Amazon territories. And in all moments, they are involved in the control of the relationships, in the free movement, and in the theme of the nationalism. I think this was very present when Jose Miguel and I started analyzing the materials that were produced by the network, when we started watching at the people who do the work of fighting against human trafficking, and that say, we have to think better about the aspects that created this union with the police and the church in the fight against human trafficking in Brazil, especially in the Amazonian territory, because I find that it's very important and fruitful. And even though it uses ideas from the past, it helps us to improve the defects of these policies. So these are the 3 points that I would like to talk about and call my attention to. And I'm sure that you can add a bit more about this chapter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Flavia and Jose Miguel. Thank you so much to our interpreter. My closing remarks are just a public note of gratitude and ongoing thanks to all current and former staff at the newly named Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. This project started over 5 years ago at the CSSJ, which has been the most loving home for a human trafficking research cluster. In 2018, we held a 2-day-long conference on the theme of whitewashing abolition, which aimed to push back against this now very prevalent but very harmful strategy that equates human trafficking with quote-unquote modern-day slavery. In my research, I saw this turn around 2010, where young American anti-trafficking activists began to replace using human trafficking, which is the legal category ushered in by the 2000 Palermo Protocols and Trafficking Victims Protection Act, with this new phrase, quote-unquote modern-day slavery, because it provided far greater emotional resonance, particularly for young Americans. It offered a way to resolve guilt around the transatlantic slave trade while capturing a nostalgia around, quote unquote, modern day abolition. So you see the anti-trafficking landscape littered with these kinds of slogans. And I and others argue that one of the reasons so many anti-trafficking organizations have turned to these metaphors, not just for their emotional resonance, but because they are ultimately so powerful. But the fundamental, and so here, I study social enterprises that train Southeast Asian and East Asian women to become seamstresses as a quote unquote pathway out of sex work. And an organization working in Cambodia makes bespoke suits and offers a William Wilberforce pocket scarf for $39 as a gesture to the British abolitionist. You see popular American anti-trafficking paramilitary organization, Operation Underground Railroad, that on its pages tries to, give a gesture to Harriet Tubman in its own name. You see the Truckers Against Trafficking, which trains truck drivers to report any kind of commercial sex that they see in travel rest stops around the country. And every year, one $2,500 Harriet Tubman Award is awarded to a truck driver who's resulted in this successful arrest of somebody who's doing sex work. And the fundamental anti-Blackness and erasure of Black suffering built into this analogy is explored in a chapter of this book authored by Lindsay Butin, who, as Kamala mentioned, also has a book out this month with Duke called Trafficking in Anti-Blackness. The blurbs on the book are actually by Kamala and Sam, so clearly we all up here recommend that you read it. Kamala and I hoped to edit a volume that exposed the hidden sources of power in this movement, and again, hidden because trafficking is so widely celebrated. And we and our co-authors were brought together and fueled by a rage towards the paradoxes, lies, deception, and power that are so often veiled as justice when you bring human trafficking into the vocabulary. So to that end, I thank the bravery of different authors, Sam, Jose Miguel, Flavia, Greg in the audience, and the 24 other authors who aren't here with us in person. Some of you here are on Zoom. Thank you for sharing your work and these stories. I also think it's important to honor the different moments of resistance that didn't make it into these pages because it simply risked too much. Most of the time, the damage and risk that we write about, talk about, is wrought upon the migrant worker, sex worker, indigenous, and communities of color that are ensnared in anti-trafficking's harmful reach. But other times, this power is also curiously felt in academic and in other institutional spaces. So in Sam O'Keefe's other prolific writing about American anti-trafficking organizations that kidnap youth living in Ghana's Lake Volta in the name of quote-unquote rescuing child sex slaves, he shows the complete impunity of white North American rescuers, even when they are faced with the resounding demands for repair and accountability by Ghanaian politicians, academics, journalists, and the very families left behind. And here is an op-ed that Sam wrote in Al Jazeera with a local MP that still has been widely ignored in favor of these American anti-trafficking organizations. But I mention this because several of us, as Kamala mentioned, sit on the editorial board of a journal that was recently threatened with a lawsuit over Sam's article that detailed the horrifying kidnapping of children in these lakeside fishing communities. The organization that had organized the kidnapping in conjunction with local police, and again, this collaboration was facilitated all to suit the emotional and political needs of the US Trafficking in Persons report. They contacted the journal and threatened to sue the journal for libel. We had hours of discussions. We had hours of talking with lawyers. It was important to note that a pro bono corporate lawyer agreed to represent them, but we were trying to scrap for free counsel through friends. But ultimately, we had to retract the article.
They were not disputing the facts of it. What they were disputing was a meeting which we claimed in our article hadn't happened, which was factual. It didn't happen. But that was one point of contention. The other had to do with the disagreement with some aspects of it. The journal offered them a right of reply, but they refused. Cause we're talking about an organization worth over $60 million. Probably more.
150
versus an academic sort NGO-owned journal, which is probably less than 2% of that. So even though it was clear that the case was going to fail if it went to court, the journal simply did not have the funds to contest it, even in the first couple of hearings. And so at the end, what happened was we had to anonymize the name of the organization in question. The article is still published, so all they wanted was not to be named, really. They weren't interested in justice or in any of the other issues that were spoken about in the paper. What they'd done was they'd taken over 100 children from a remote indigenous community in Ghana under the suspicion that these were victims of trafficking, and then found out they weren't. They were just poor children working with their families and their communities, and nothing of the sort that they had alleged. And some of these kids had been held for over 6 months. In the course of taking the children, they'd brutalized the islanders. One of the men we interviewed there, 70-year-old man, they'd broken 7 of his ribs and offered him no health care whatsoever. They simply deposited him back at the lake shore after they found out he was injured. So all of these things are documented. They are factual. They weren't interested in those. They simply wanted the story to go away, or their names taken away from it, just to give them the anonymity and the ability to still continue raising funds, selling the misery of these communities, as it were, without any of the funds they raise. I mean, if you look at these communities, I think just a percentage, even 1% of what this NGO raises can transform people's lives over there. The children and their families work primarily due to socioeconomic deprivation. There are no schools, no hospitals, nothing. And the paradox is that they arrested the children and their families. The parents were charged with child exploitation and depriving their children of education, although there are no schools on the islands. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Sam's work is so important because it points to the legacies of colonial theft that have led to these very structural conditions. And I mentioned that, that is a thread that connects this book, but I mentioned it in particular because, as Sam mentioned, that anonymous organization has a $150 million annual budget. Truckers Against Trafficking, smaller, $3.8 million. Operation Underground Railroad, $56 million. Suffice it to say, there is absolutely no scarcity of resources when it comes to anti-trafficking. Though they are absolutely consolidated amongst the most militaristic, colonial, racist, and imperialist actors. And this volume demands a way to reconceptualize how we engage with anti-trafficking more creatively and urgently. And on that note of creativity, I'd like to thank Yin Q. Thank you for serving as our esteemed moderator on what is officially the last day of your artist residency at Brown. We are so incredibly saddened by that. Your work this semester has transformed our campus community. Yin, a filmmaker, cultural activist, renowned BDSM, kink educator, sex worker, and sex worker rights activist, has spent this past semester teaching the sexual politics of consent, work, race, and care to students through rope bondage, much to the chagrin of Brown's General Counsel. So please join me in cheersing retirement, the end of a semester, the end of a residency, the completion of a beautiful series of new books by the CSREA, and mostly a commitment to redistributing power and resources to communities most impacted by not just trafficking, but anti-trafficking alike. Thank you all so much.